Welcome back. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 8.4, describe how people can use their knowledge of social influence to change others' behaviors. So we're going to start with looking at a couple of different kinds of norms in understanding how social influence works to change the behaviors of people around you. A lot of this research has involved trying to get people to comply with rules or expectations, trying to get them to change their behavior in a direction that is more socially positive. Cialdini and colleagues wanted to test out different kinds of norms to see which norms were actually operating when they were trying to get people to do good behaviors like not littering or something like that. The first step, they argued, was to figure out what kind of norms were actually functioning, meaning what kind of norms were people using to guide their own behavior. They made the distinction between two different kinds of norms. Injunctives are assumptions that we make about approved of behaviors and disapproved of behaviors. So, out in the wild, there are lots of things that are either approved of or disapproved of. Littering, throwing cigarette butts on the ground, leaving trash are considered to be disapproved of behaviors, but people do them all the time. So the injunctive is don't litter, but the actual behavior, that's the descriptive norm. So that's what are people's perceptions of how people behave in these situations, whether it's approved of or not. So I'm thinking of the example of if I go to a major league baseball game and, I'm in Progressive Field watching the Guardians play, and there are all kinds of norms. They don't want you to leave your trash at your seat. They want you to take it to trash receptacles and recycling bins and dispose of it yourself. But the descriptive norm on the ground, people leave their cups. They leave the detritus of all of their peanut shells on the ground, wrappers on the ground, food trays on the ground, and someone else has to clean all that up. So the injunctive is don't leave your trash, clean up after yourself, but the descriptive is that people litter. So the idea is, how do we change people's behavior? And that was the nature of the research Cialdini and others did. In the study, they manipulated the type of norm that was being communicated, and then they did some measurements. So if you can see in this graphic from your textbook, what does the environment look like? That's the orange bars. So they manipulated, either orange bars are clean, blue bars are littered. And that's what you would see around you in the environment. So either it's a very clean space or a very littered space. Now, in the control condition, you have a confederate of the experimenters, just walks by and doesn't do anything. In the descriptive condition, and again, you have two different environmental conditions, but in the descriptive condition, you have a confederate walks by and drops a food bag on the ground. In the injunctive condition, the confederate walks by and picks up the bag and puts it in the trash. And then they wanted to document, what would happen, what type of norm was salient in the situation. So for the control group, you had 37 to 38% of people who actually littered a piece of paper that was left on their vehicle. And this was a common experience at the time. I hardly ever see it anymore. But you used to get advertisements from businesses where someone would just walk around a parking lot and stick an advertisement under your windshield wiper. And for a lot of people, this raises a conundrum. Do I take the thing off my windshield and put it in my car, or do I just throw it on the ground? So you have a decision to make as the person. When the descriptive norm is made salient, that would be in the middle of this graph. When you have a person who walks by and actually litters, then In the littered environment, people feel freed up to litter even more. But in the clean environment, they litter much less. Then when the injunctive norm is made salient, that's when you get the lowest levels of actual littering. So when you have someone who models cleaning up behavior, in the clean environment, you get even cleaner. In the littered environment, backwards. In the clean environment, you have reductions compared to the other two groups. In the littered environment, you have people being even more tidy, meaning they're much less likely to litter. So what you can see here in this study is manipulating the injunctive, but also manipulations of the descriptive can have a significant impact on what people will choose to do. And what these researchers were able to really creatively do in the field was to show that you can, in fact, manipulate what norms are the most present, most available and accessible in mind. And once it's made available, once it's made accessible, that tends to determine your behavior. You do have to be careful, though, about invoking descriptive norms because they can backfire. I have an image here of an actual kind of graphic that was included in some energy bills that people would get. And what they wanted to do was try to compel people to conserve more by giving them information about the behaviors of their neighbors and kind of invoke a certain degree of competition among them. What researchers have found about the possible boomerang effect, which would be where if you invoke the descriptive norms, it may backfire and people's behavior will get even worse. What researchers have found is if you give people both types of information, the descriptive and the injunctive, that is the most successful in helping them to improve their behavior. So in the case of energy consumption, you give them concrete descriptive information about, say, all neighbors. So here, your most efficient neighbors, and then what you're doing. And that gives you some idea. The injunctive is communicating to you that good performance, great performance that has lots of smiley faces, that's the injunctive. You're getting some reinforcement for following the injunctive. In addition, you're given descriptive information of what all your neighbors are doing. And you can compare yourself to that. And in a way, it makes it look like you're winning at being a good person, right? And what researchers have found is if you just give them the injunctive, that's not quite as powerful as giving them both the descriptive and the injunctive. There are lots of different tactics for compelling people to do certain things. These are just a few of them. So the foot in the door technique happens a lot in door-to-door sales. That's why it's called foot in the door. And it's a strategy where you get people to first agree to something small, and then that tends to make them more likely to agree to a larger request later. So, for example, when politicians do door-to-doors or they have their operatives do door-to-doors, they often come bearing a little gift. And so they will come to you and say, would you like a notepad? Would you like a sticker? Would you like these pens? And if you say yes, because they've made a request of you and you've said yes, you take their notepad that has the candidate's name on it, then they want to ask you for something bigger. They want you to sign a pledge or a petition to support their politician's stance on some kind of social issue. That's a bigger ask because you're actually going to be asked to put your name and contact information on this form. Or they may just ask you, will you vote for my candidate, which is a larger ask. And what's been found is if you can get someone to take your gift your notepad, your pens, your stickers, they are significantly more likely to say yes to the second request. And part of what's happening here is this norm where if you take something nice from someone else, or even if you just say yes to them about anything, then you feel like to renege, there's almost like this social contract. Once you've said yes the first time, you feel like compelled to continue saying yes. Otherwise, you kind of feel like you're being a jerk about it. Sometimes foot in the door involves some chit chat and some get to know you, and you've kind of committed your time. You've given your time to talk to this person, and by kind of engaging them in that sort of banter, it's like you've granted them a small request, and then they hit you with the larger one. I've also seen this in vacuum sales. Believe it or not, there used to be door-to-door salespeople who would go around the neighborhood and try to sell you a ridiculously expensive vacuum cleaner with all kinds of bells and whistles and attachments. And what they would do with the foot in the door is, hey, I'd like to demo this vacuum cleaner by cleaning one room of your house. That may seem like a lot, but it's small. It's a small request compared to the $4,000 price tag of the sweeper system. So they come in, they clean, and that means they've already kind of given you a present. And that makes you significantly more likely to listen to their whole pitch about the ridiculously expensive vacuum cleaner. Now, the door in the face technique is the opposite. What it requires is you give people a really big request, and I've seen this in a number of door-to-door sales activities where they will come in and say, here's this one really fancy product, and they expect you to reject it. So there were gutter salespeople, like gutters for your house, who came to my door one time several years ago, and they had this pitch packet. And in the pitch packet, they said, here's our premier product. And they described it, and then they described the cost. And the cost was really high. And I was like, no, I'm not paying that for my gutters. My gutters are fine. They're just regular gutters, and they make the water go where it's supposed to go. So I was ready to close the door in the salesperson's face. And he says, but wait, here's a different option. And it was half the cost. And what happens, unless you're a social psychologist and like you're sitting there going, whoa, you're door in the facing me, I can smell it. A lot of people will fall for that and say, oh, well, you're cutting me a break. And how nice that is of you to cut me a break. When they're actually not cutting you a break, that's the product they wanted you to buy in the first place. Now, propaganda takes advantage of social influence tactics by manipulating attitudes of thousands of people at the same time, often by giving them really heavily emotionally laden but misleading information. Now, I'll leave you to find examples of that on your own because they are everywhere in our current political climate. People on both sides of the political divide are equally likely to be sending out propaganda at varying levels of accuracy, but they're all very emotionally charged. And it's that emotional component, once you tweak that antenna, people kind of start to be fearful. So propaganda often has a very fear-laden element to it. And like what you learned earlier in this class, fear works when you're given a specific behavior to perform in order to reduce the fear. And that behavior in this case is support our side, don't believe anything the other side says. And if you do that, you'll be better off. So that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 8.4. In the next video, we'll be looking at obedience to authority in our coverage of Learning Objective 8.5.